Today's episode is not just a conversation about shadow work. It is an initiation into the deepest work you could ever do with your own shadow, in relationships, in intimacy, in truly any area of your life. The shadow is invisible, elusive, and seductive. It hides in plain sight, and if we're not radically honest with ourselves, shadow work can quickly turn into shadow feeding. Most spiritual seekers bypass the true path because shadow work is raw, it is confronting, it is bringing to the light what wants to remain hidden. But there is also hidden gold and something incredible that awaits us when we truly start to bring our shadow to the light. Our guide today is Connie Zweig. She is an expert and a pioneer. Connie is worldwide known as the shadow expert, co-author of the groundbreaking book Meeting the Shadow, and author of Romancing the Shadow and the Inner Work of Age. She is also the founder of the Center for Shadow Work and Spiritual Counseling and spent 3 decades serving as a clinician, bringing the unconscious into the light with extraordinary skill and true depth. This conversation will change the way you see yourself in relationships, your intimacy, and even the way you approach aging and spiritual work. If you are ready for a real transmission, one that is raw, one that is embodied and uncompromising, this is it. First of all, I just want to express that it's a true honor to have you on the show. Thank you for being here, Connie.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
The way you teach about the shadow is truly, truly profound. I feel it really goes straight to the core. And you've said that spirituality itself can actually strengthen the shadow, like idolizing a guru, worshipping something, or even bypassing, all while avoiding the raw shadow material that remains untouched inside us. I also see the opposite in today's world. I call it spiritual nihilism, where people are saying everything is an illusion, nothing matters, or everything is the shadow. And both seem to avoid true shadow work in different ways. My question here is, what is the true path of shadow work?
Such a simple question. I'm not sure how much to assume our listeners understand. So can we start with a definition?
Yes, please, absolutely.
Okay, because I think there's a lot of sort of mistaken identity around what the shadow is, what Carl Jung meant by it when he coined the term, and what people mean by it today, because shadow work is all over TikTok and everywhere else, and I think that there's some confusion happening. So when we're very young and we're growing up, we get all these messages from all the adults around us about what's good and what's bad, what will bring us love and approval, and what will bring us punishment or criticism or shame. And we're like little sponges, and so we're just absorbing these messages from older siblings, parents, teachers, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and so on. Churches, other religious communities, all these messages are kind of seeping in, and what they're doing is they're shaping the content that goes into the shadow or the personal unconscious. So what's good, positive, approved of, shapes the ego, the conscious personality, and the little kid says, I'm going to be a nice little boy. I'm going to be a smart little girl. And everything else that's carrying what we think of as negative traits goes into the shadow, the unconscious, and forms that content. But it's only negative in relation to the ego. It's not inherently negative to feel anger or sexuality or whatever it is that we're stuffing at that moment into the shadow. So throughout the lifespan, there's this constant dynamic going on in adolescence, in early adulthood, in midlife, where we're continuing to receive these messages about what's okay, what's not okay, what's taboo. Are we going to try to express what's taboo, like in adolescence, Are we going to rebel against what we're being told? And sometimes that's a conscious process and sometimes it's an unconscious process. But throughout the lifespan, this formative shaping of our psychology is going on. And at different points, at different moments, sometimes in transitions or crises, difficult emotional moments, that repressed material that's hidden in the shadow will erupt. Maybe it's a pattern of criticizing your partner. Maybe it's a pattern of addiction with food or sex or love or drugs or alcohol. Maybe it's a depression, an intractable mood. We don't know where it came from. Maybe it's a recurring dream in which we act out something that we would never do in waking life. So we meet the shadow in all these many ways throughout our lives as it erupts from the unconscious. Also in projection. So we recognize, let's say, for example, we walk into a party and we imagine, oh, that woman, she's so seductive. And we don't know anything about her. Or that man, he's so aggressive. And then we recognize that we're projecting on that person. We get to know them and they're not that way at all. So that's another example of how we meet the shadow in our daily lives.
I think also a specific confusion is around the shadow and the ego, where people say, well, the shadow is the ego is the shadow, they're the same. How would you define the relationship between the ego and the shadow?
Well, if we really oversimplify it, and we really sort of let go of accuracy, but we oversimplify it to understand it, they hold opposite traits. So if in your family academic performance is praised and rewarded, and you work really hard in school and you come to believe that you're smart and successful, that's the development of your ego, your conscious personality. So what goes into the shadow then? The fear of not knowing, of looking stupid, of failing school or failing a test. So you can see how they carry sort of opposite qualities. That's kind of a simple way of looking at it. The ego is not real. It's not a substance. It's not an object. It's a mechanism. It's a psychological mechanism that allows us to operate in society. But in the spiritual world, it's understood that it's not something solid. It's not something real. And the same is true with the shadow. The shadow is not a cave inside the mind where all of our secrets are hidden. The shadow is distributed throughout the body mind. It's in our muscles. It's in our nerves. It's in our feelings. It's in our thoughts. There's shadow material in the subtle body, in the chakras. Every chakra is carrying shadow material. And so it's in some ways also insubstantial, but it serves a function, which is carrying the forbidden material so that we can operate in society, so that we can be social beings, political beings, family members, and so on.
Going back to the simple question I asked you at the beginning around what I'm seeing, and maybe you'll agree that it can be easy to kind of avoid the shadow in the journey of trying to do shadow work. Things can become a projection. We can say, oh, I'm doing shadow work, but actually inside what's going on is wanting to be seen doing shadow work and be perceived as a spiritual person. And at the same time, there can be a sense of, oh, well, it's all the shadow and you'll never find a way, which can almost sound depressing. So what would you say to a person who would ask you, how do I make sure I'm truly working with the raw material of my shadow?
The nature of the shadow is to hide. It's tricky. So it's not surprising that people think they're grasping it and solidifying it and looking at it, because in the next instant, it's gone. You see through a projection, and the next instant, you're projecting again, because that's the nature of the mind. Or you begin to work on some habitual pattern in your relationship, and the next day you're repeating it again, because the shadow is slippery and it's bottomless. We're never going to become completely conscious of the unconscious. That's not going to happen for any of us. And you mentioned spiritual bypass. So if we believe that we're doing meditation and spiritual practice to eliminate the shadow, in most cases that's an illusion because it's not the level that spiritual practice works on. And so we can be sitting in meditation and feel still and quiet and fail to recognize that shadow material is bubbling up. Or we can learn how to witness our thoughts and fail to realize that some of those thoughts are rising from the unconscious. But in meditation, we're learning not to take them seriously. They're just clouds passing by. And so it can seem as if these teachings are contradictory. But what I want to suggest is that they're just happening at different levels of being human. So what happens is we start to recognize what we're saying to ourselves. What are these repeating thoughts, these inner messages? And it could be in meditation, it could be in waking life, standing in the line at the grocery store. And what are the feelings that go with those thoughts? And what are the bodily sensations that go with those thoughts and feelings? And then we have 3 dimensions, body, emotion, and thoughts, 3 dimensions of what I call a shadow character. We personify it into a shadow character and we give it a name. Let's say we call it the critic, and we give it an image. Let's say the image of the critic is shaking your finger at someone. Now we have all these cues to recognize that this figure that was previously unconscious is now coming up when you're standing in the grocery line thinking about your husband and thinking about him in a critical way, or your wife, or your partner, or your kid, or your teacher, whoever it is. And guess what happens? Every single time the critic arises from the unconscious, the thoughts are the same, the feelings are the same, and the sensations are the same. When I discovered this, it blew my mind. That's how we can begin to make a conscious relationship with these unconscious figures. So then we have a choice. Oh, the critic is here. Am I going to act that out again and hurt my partner's feelings and create distance? Or am I going to make a different choice? Say, for example, use an I statement. I'm feeling angry instead of you did that again. So we begin to make our relationships more conscious as we make our shadow figures more conscious. Now, if we are saying to ourselves, oh, I know I'm critical, I'll work on it, and that's that, we're not really doing shadow work because we're not really catching that energy when it needs to be seen. There's a reason it's coming up from the unconscious to be processed. Every shadow character has a valid need. One of the things I discovered with the critic is there's a valid need for distance inside of it. And often what happens is people get critical because they're unconsciously making distance because they don't know how to do it consciously, intentionally. Hey, honey, I need a day to myself. I'll see you at 6 o'clock. And instead of doing that, they criticize the person and make the distance. And every shadow figure has a valid need like that, even the most destructive ones. You know, you mentioned the need to be seen. Often that's the hidden need in the shadow figure, the need to be seen, the need to be heard, nurtured.
When you say that the need to be seen, even when a person has a very strong projection, which is really pushing the other person away, often what's screaming underneath that is the desire to be held and to be seen. But of course, as you said, in a very unskillful way, because it has been so suppressed, and that person doesn't know how to actually articulate that in a conscious, vulnerable and grounded way. Connie, you said the shadow's nature is that it wants to hide. And I think that is what perhaps is one of the greatest challenges with shadow work, that we have to put it at the forefront of our awareness, that this part does not want to be made conscious. It doesn't want to be exposed to the light. I'm just thinking of an example in my own marriage. One of my biggest challenges that I had to work for, I'm still working through, but it's that conditioning of I didn't do anything wrong. right? I would have this reaction to things where my wife would, from a very loving place, come to me, and my response would be almost harsh. I didn't do anything wrong. It's not my fault. Causing tension in moments that were actually not just safe, but deeply loving, right? This also leads into the whole topic of sabotage, if you want to call it that way. But would you describe this as kind of the shadow coming from the unconscious in those moments?
So, what are you protecting when you say, I didn't do anything wrong, as a kind of automatic response? Do you know what the vulnerable feelings underneath that? Have you gotten there?
Yeah, that I don't want to be a failure. And of course, that led deeper into a sense of unworthiness that I had to work through.
So you've done the next step. Once we have the shadow figure, then you trace it back in your history and you identify, when did you last feel that way? And then before that, and see how far back you can go, that you're afraid of being a failure. How far back does that go? And what were the messages that led to that fear? What shaped that little boy to have that shadow character? So your whole story kind of opens up from that one moment, that one exchange with your wife, right? You begin to see this whole story that you've carried throughout your life and that you've told yourself over and over again. So if you have a parent who makes you wrong, who blames you, then you develop a certain kind of defense against feedback. You can't take it in because it's too scary. So what's the valid need in that? I don't know if you've given this shadow.
Yeah, no, a lot actually. But when you asked what's the valid need, it's that it is okay to be imperfect, to still be loved while being imperfect. And when I gave myself that permission, I would then feel the love of my wife, because before I wouldn't receive it, because that shadow character was like, no, the heart closed in that moment. And when I gave myself permission to receive it, and I don't want to make this about me, but I want to make this really clear to the listener, I could feel the love in that moment. It's like, wait a moment, you don't need to defend yourself. You don't need to say I didn't do anything wrong. And even if I did something imperfect or forgot about something, I am still lovable, right? And that's a journey, of course. I don't want to say I'm perfectly healed from that, but it's truly incredible how something that doesn't seem like a big thing almost, that feels so natural in that moment, opens that kind of Pandora box into the whole kind of story and what has been running or has been in the background in one's life and sabotaging them from love, from abundance, from appreciating the beauty. Talking about spirituality here and the shadow in spirituality specifically, in your decades of experience, what shadow in spirituality have you observed the most?
So when I was in my 20s, I got involved with transcendental meditation and was very excited to become a TM teacher, as many people were in the 1970s. And I was really loving the meditation. But then after a few years, I began to notice the group became more coercive, kind of less open and permissive, and more coercive, more groupthink, more pressure to conform. People began to tell lies in order to get new practices. The teacher was doing things that were hypocritical, not following his own advice. And so I left, and it was a devastating, heartbreaking experience because I just couldn't tolerate the hypocrisy. And I lost all my friends in the community, and I lost my practice and my purpose. And that kind of shaped me. And I think many people have their version of that experience. You know, it could be in a church community or a synagogue. It could be in another kind of Eastern path, the Buddhist or Sufi or shamanic path or Hindu path. Now with the psychedelic communities, some of this stuff is happening. And so I ended up going to graduate school and writing about the longing for transcendence. That became my dissertation, The Holy Longing. And that then became a book, which is called Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path. And I just felt compelled to understand, how is it possible that in the most sacred arena of our lives, where we offer our souls where we offer our devotion, that so many people feel disillusioned and even abused by the teacher or the group. So I just applied depth psychology to try to understand this. So what is the most common? I would say power, sex, and money are the
That's
three
a good
areas,
answer.
right? So power shadow is extremely common in spiritual communities, partly because the teachers have not fully processed their own shadow material. And many of them come from other cultures and monastic life into the West, and there are all these cultural differences. Some of them have never seen sexually active people before. Some of them have never experienced the self-expression and autonomy, of their Western students and don't know what to do with it, so they get more and more controlling. Some of them are identified with their minds and become dogmatic around their teachings. So there's shadow material that's unprocessed for everyone. And if you are carrying the projection of 1,000 people, or in India, 1,000,000 people and some teachers, right? You're carrying this massive projection and expecting to be perfect, expected to be fully enlightened, whatever that means, and be the exemplar for all these people. It's a lot of pressure. And a lot of people crack under that pressure. And they crack around power, sex, and money. So, there are stories in the book around teachers who are, start out by tithing and end up taking the whole estate from their students, every bit of their money. Or sexual assault of male and female students. Or marrying students where, from my point of view, you can't really have a contemporary equal marriage in that situation. You're going to have a different dynamic. Abuse of power around all kinds of control, what you wear, what you eat, who you marry, what you think. And so the students or devotees, some of them are set up for that by their family dynamics. So if there is a very kind of patriarchal, bossy, dominant father in the family, then that feels familiar to your psyche. It doesn't feel scary or threatening. It feels familiar. Oh, that's how it's supposed to be, right? If you were not seen as special and you are unknowingly, unconsciously coming into the community to have a special relationship with the teacher and you're chosen for whatever reason, for sex or for money or for power, then you go for it. And so there's this match between the teacher's shadow material and the student's unconscious shadow material. And then this dance takes place. And some people stay for decades, live their lives that way and turn the other way when they see abuse. I mean, there's child abuse in some of the communities. There's, the term crazy wisdom is used to rationalize a lot of abusive behavior. And this is non-denominational. This is going, in every single lineage, this is happening. So it's very tragic to me. I interviewed a lot of people who've experienced this and, found symptoms of PTSD and depression and also giving up on spiritual practice because that kind of disillusionment and harm, lead people to hopelessness.
The image I have in mind also is, or this metaphor we could say, is that it's almost like the journey where so many people at some point in their spiritual journey they might start to think or fall under the illusion or this spell of, oh, I'm enlightened now, I have done my work, I've integrated my shadow or whatever it is, right? Because they might have a peak experience, a real peak experience, identifying with that and assuming, well, that's it now. And I think that these examples of gurus or teachers who are then misusing their power, often in horrendous ways, it's also a warning for, in a way, for every single person in that sense, that we can all fall in the trap of believing we've done the work we needed to do. Whereas in truth, At least I believe that a truly enlightened person, if you want to use that word, is a person who will never say, I've integrated all my shadow, I am divinely enlightened. They're usually, from my perspective, a very humble person, a person who is very honest about their own shadow.
Yeah, I don't know that we can generalize about personalities in awake people. I think that, Ken Wilber has made so many extraordinary contributions to our understandings of these things. So one is states and stages. So what you're describing is that people experience an advanced state, and then they take that to mean, they interpret that as they're awake. And so now they should teach. But they didn't actually attain a new stage of development that gets stabilized from which they can operate. And so they're really not prepared to teach. The other thing among the many things, is lines of development. So we develop along these lines very separately. So for example, you don't expect someone who's awake to be a mathematical genius or a musical genius, composing symphonies or something. So there's cognitive development, emotional development, moral development, relational development, artistic. So there's all these different lines of development. And so if somebody wakes up, as you say, but is still not that developed along the relational line, let's say, they could still look like they're arrogant or controlling, or they don't develop morally. They have high spiritual attainment, but their moral line of development is not cultivated. Then what happens? They can act out their shadow material, even without a lot of conscience, without a lot of empathy. I mean, we've seen these stories over and over again of these teachers who seem to be very advanced, but don't have empathy and break the law and break the ethics and harm people that they're supposed to be caring for. So I think there are many levels of explanation and many different personality traits that show up. My husband is in a very advanced stage of awareness. He's not fully cooked. I mean, I live with him, right? I see him up close. But he lives full time in non-dual awareness, in unity with everything. That doesn't mean he would never claim that all his shadow material is processed or that his personality or his psychology is perfect. I mean, that's not what it's about.
Moving into the topic of relationships, which you already touched upon. Connie, would you agree with the phrase, relationships are the ultimate form of shadow work?
For me, relationships are the cooker. At different stages of our lives, our relationships are different. So let's say when we're dating and we're in the romantic cycle, most people don't show their shadows in the first year. I used to tell my clients, please don't get married in the first year because they don't know each other. They don't know each other in crisis. They don't know each other in mood swings or in all kinds of struggles. And so then after the dating, if people commit, what are they committing to? Are they committing to that persona that they've known for the first year? Or do they actually know each other's shadow materials? So Neil and I waited 5 years before we got married because we had had so many conflicts by then and we knew our shadow characters. And when we got married, part of our vow was to honor and respect each other's shadow characters. If you have a persona marriage or romantic marriage, you kind of set yourself up for shadow work being, a big part of the relationship because you don't know what's coming. You don't really know the depth of the issues in each other yet. So yes, relationship is a vehicle for shadow work. Single people can also do shadow work about being single. Why aren't they in a relationship? Do they want a relationship? About friendships. about family members, about work colleagues. So I think because our culture mythologizes romantic relationships and everybody makes it so important and thinks that's what's going to save them, that's kind of why this carries so much charge and so much promise, you know. If only I find the right person, I won't have to do shadow work all the time.
Yeah, and I think the opposite can be so powerful of that. The opposite of like, with the right person, we can do the deepest shadow work together. It's almost like you flip that on its head rather than the myth that, well, an escapism from the shadow ultimately. Desire for union from an escapism of the shadow, and then leading to so many challenges. It's also a vow that my wife and I have made, the vow of that whatever arises, we always say that the highest priority is to move through whatever stands between us and the highest love or the highest union. So it's almost like the relationship or the marriage is constant shadow work, but not in a way people would think like draining and serious and heavy all the time, but almost like a looking forward even to a degree. I mean, no one loves it, I would say, but even a sense of, okay, it will arise, and it will arise again and again and again, and that's not a problem. That's actually part of it being exposed to the light or made conscious. So is it ever the goal to be free of the shadow in a relationship, or is there always a dance with the unseen?
Well, what you describe in your own marriage is so beautiful and not something to avoid or be afraid of. So if you're a seeker and you thrive in self-knowledge and learning about yourself and learning about your beloved and uncovering more together, then you're going to want that kind of relationship, you know, an evolutionary couple. If you get stuck in your roles, if you get focused on kids or careers, some of that is going to go into the background at different stages. You know, you may just not have the psychic energy to continually focus on each other throughout the whole lifespan. So shadow work changes later in life for couples and individuals. So Neil and I have been together 30 years. It's changed now. It's much kind of mellower, less drama. It doesn't mean we're not intentionally avoiding meeting the shadow. Issues come up all the time, but we trust that we have the tools and that we have the love. And I think, you know, Robert Bly, wonderful poet, wrote this poem called The Third Body. And the third body is like the third energy field in a conscious couple that sits with you and contains you, and it's kind of palpable. You can kind of feel that there's something greater than two individuals. And when that field is generated, there's a safety and a trust and a sense, like, let's say when you get triggered and you feel afraid of abandonment or afraid of failure or afraid of being criticized, that third body kind of supports you. And there's this felt sense of safety. It's not a cognitive thing. It's like, okay, I know we're together. This is holding us. And in that way, I think in a long-term relationship, shadow work becomes less scary and less confrontational. Like you said, it doesn't have to be so heavy.
I believe that a lot of people have that fantasy that you also described about how one can get to this place. And I believe that in reality, it is very different. But what people are yearning for a relationship where they feel what you've just described, it is possible. The route there might just be very different than what our ego or what our beliefs tell us of how it is going to be. And tying this into identity, I believe that a huge aspect also is letting go of false identities, things that we have identified ourselves with, things of who we believe ourselves to be or how things have to be. What do we have to let go of to make the journey of shadow work not just more enjoyable, but, like you said, romance the shadow?
So as we go through the lifespan and we identify more and more with these limited identities of the ego, I'm a good student, or I'm a good sister, or I'm the best son, or I'm a CEO, I'm a great therapist, I'm a Black progressive lesbian, or I'm a white conservative evangelical, right? All of these ethnic, religious, age-related, racial identities are all part of the ego. And this is a very big issue in our culture right now, because developmentally, people are identifying differently. Gender, sexual orientation, these are necessary steps, I think, in human development, but they're not our true nature. They're not our spiritual essence. And so they can be traps. They can either be steps along the way, if we do our spiritual practices, or they can be traps that keep the ego held in place. You know, I'm a traditional wife. I'm going to homeschool my kids and teach them what's right and wrong, right? That can block a person from a higher state and ultimately a higher stage. So in later life, I think our task, especially with retirement, is to let go of the roles and the narrow identities that we've amassed over the years. And this is not an easy task because they're built in at this point. They're the operating system. And so we begin to identify them and disidentify with them. Okay, I am not that. Who am I? And that perennial question, who am I, comes back again. Who am I really? And whatever your language or your lineage for that, you know, I am Buddha nature. I am Christ nature. I am spirit. I am pure consciousness. I am the breath that breathes everything. Whatever resonates for you, you can begin to practice sinking into identifying with that and embodying that. And that's part of the spiritual work. And so we let go. You ask, what do we let go of? And this is different for different people. You know, there are some people who are never going to let go of being identified as a parent, right? That's just too much, too big a part of who they are. But when your career's over, you can let go of that role. If you become ill, you need to let go of being a healthy person. If you become widowed, you need to let go of being a married person. Because life changes, everything keeps changing. And so our identities need to keep shifting, both with the circumstances and with our intention to wake up to a higher identity.
And would you say that is an elemental part of shadow work? Being able to let go of identities?
I think some people have an intuition about this, Lorene. Like you said, seekers. There's a resonance when people hear this. They know they're not their true nature. They know they've been living a story. They know there's more. I mean, this is what people used to ask me. I know there's more than this, more than this material world, more than our roles, more than money, more than success, more than psychology. So with shadow work, the way I cultivate it, because I'm a spiritual practitioner for all these decades, I didn't want people to discover their shadow characters and then fall into identifying with them, another limited identity. No. And so the practice is really to witness that shadow character. You know, okay, let's say you steal something, but I am not a thief. I committed a bad act, but I am not a thief. So always when I taught shadow work, I taught meditation practice with it so that you could learn centering, quieting, and watching your mind as the shadow character arises. Okay, why do I have that impulse to steal that candy bar, whatever it is? And then practice recognizing that's a shadow character. It's not who I am. And that's always a part of it. So you identify the shadow character and you remind yourself, it's not who I am. I'm so much bigger than that. I'm a soul on a journey. I'm spirit incarnated, right? However you want to say it, not that little shadow character that acted out in that moment.
I believe the importance here is also around embodiment, because of course one could say, I am limitless spirit, and still project their shadow, right? I like what you said before about the kind of the practicality of that in that moment when it arises, that's the ripe moment. That's the spiritual moment, quote unquote. That's the moment where a true awakening can be born. There's a saying that says the spiritual work begins on the meditation cushion, but it really becomes ripe then in relationship when the shadow becomes triggered.
And shadow work is spiritual work.
One last topic that I wanted to go into is around specifically the shadow around sex. Because there's so much shame around that for people to unpack other shadow characters might seem a little bit easier than to unpack the shadow character using your language around sex. How can one begin to truly unpack this, and is there hidden gold in there?
You know, I was in private practice for 30 years, and I was very surprised that I discovered more charge and shame around money than around sex. Money is a really big shadow issue for people. Sexuality is complicated and I think very individual. And if our listeners want to begin to explore this, you could ask yourself, what were the messages I received really early in life about sexuality? Did anybody speak openly to me about it? Did anyone educate me? Did anyone punish me, criticize me, say for touching myself or touching someone else? And what happened as I grew up and went to school? What was the attitude from the school, the teachers and the peers? What was the vibe in the sex education class? Can you remember that? Can you remember how the adults talked to the kids about it? And then as you kind of go through your life, you can look at your relationships through this filter, through this lens. What was your first sexual experience like? And what was your first ongoing relationship like sexually? Were you able to talk, ask for what you need, ask him or her what they wanted? Almost like a life review, but from the lens of sexuality. And then you begin to have the whole story of your sex life and the feelings and the behaviors. Did you ever act out in a wild way? Did you ever hide your sexuality? What carries the most shame or awkwardness? What do you not want to be seen about your sexuality? And what step might you take now to begin to liberate a little of that energy, to begin to express just a little bit, just begin to express something that you haven't expressed before, and then watch what fear comes up as you imagine that. What are you saying to yourself as you imagine taking that step? And what are you feeling? And what are the sensations in your body? Oh my God, I would go to hell. Oh my God, I wouldn't want anyone to know about that. Oh, this is so embarrassing. And you begin to kind of uncover who's the shadow character who's there and where did it come from? And you have a choice. Do you want to leave it that way? Is this acceptable to you? It can be okay. You're allowed to have limitations. Or do you want to make a change? Do you want to begin to romance that shadow character and not allow it to limit you anymore?
And do I assume correctly that this could be applied in just the same way around money and around power? This deep form of self-inquiry and then seeing how it plays out. And just before we close today, it brings me back to something you said at the beginning of our conversation, that it's always the same. the same trigger around money, the same thing we say to ourselves around sex.
It's the same when it's the same shadow character. So the money character and the shadow character won't be this, and the sexual character won't be the same. But when it's around sexuality, yes, that shadow character will be telling you the same thing. And that money character will be telling you the same thing. And that's what makes this work, because then you can begin to have a conscious relationship with that figure that was previously unconscious. And you can choose to stop it from sabotaging you or limiting you or hurting others.
And last question, to take this even further, beyond just having a conscious relationship with it, you also spoke about that often hidden within are deep desires. So perhaps going even beyond that, there is a deep creativity, even a joy, a bliss, a deep sense of beauty that is then able to flow. Might that be the light at the end of the tunnel of doing this work at a really deep and devoted level?
You know, shadow is just energy. It's blocked energy. It's blocked juice. It only has a negative charge because we look at it that way from the ego. So if it's released, yes, it can move into creative self-expression. It can move into deeper intimacy. It can move into greater joy. Absolutely. That's one of the promises of this work.
From repression into self-expression. Thank you for sharing your depth with us. For people listening to you today, perhaps they want to deepen their journey. Many of our listeners, they're deep on that path. Or others who want to begin that journey. What's the best way to start? Where can they find your work?
Well, there are a lot of free videos on conniezweig.com. If you want to read, Meeting the Shadow just came out with a new edition, and it just sweeps all the arenas of life: politics, creativity, relationships, health and the body, everything you can imagine, and the shadow. Romancing the Shadow is the method for relationships, couples, and also friendships and workplace. Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path is particular focus on spiritual shadow, if that's of interest to you. And the Inner Work of Age is about which shadows come up in midlife and beyond. I call it the inner ageist and the doer. And so if that speaks to you, you can check that out. I have a podcast with my husband that's called Dr. Neil's Spiritual Awakening to Non-Duality. So there are lots of resources available for people to follow up, and I'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you for listening to this episode or watching this episode. It is a true honor to have you here. If you haven't yet subscribed to the show, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify or Apple Podcast or any other platform, I invite you to subscribe now. This allows you to gain immediate access once a new episode is released. And if you feel that this episode or any other episode can serve someone you know deeply, it would mean the world to us if you can share it with them, because it allows us to reach more people. It allows us to bring this deep and transformative work to more people and to expand it. Once again, thank you so much for being here.